We are in Romans chapter 6, and just want to look at verse 12. We have gone a little bit past verse 12, but not by much. Romans chapter 6, verse 12, and it's this discussion really concerning, it starts off concerning baptism, and it is a discussion of grace and a discussion of law and a discussion of whose slave you are going to be, and this is going to continue into chapter 7, of whether to righteousness or whether to sin. But in verse 12, therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lust. And here is a direct command. This is a command. It doesn't get any plainer than this. It is a direct command. Do not let sin reign in your mortal body, which means that you could do that. You could let sin reign again. Now, we need to understand who he is addressing, because he's not just addressing people at large. He's addressing a particular congregation in Rome. These are members of the church. These are Christians. This is the church at Rome. And he's talking to them. Are these people among the saved? Yes, they are. But he says that they are not to let sin reign in their mortal bodies, that they should obey it in its lust. Meaning that even after you are saved, you can still obey sin in its lust. You can still allow it to reign in your mortal bodies. You can still do that. There is an escape from all that. There's an escape from sin and escape from its reign over you, and going into being among the saved, but one can go right back into that captivity. One can go right back, as we read last week in 2 Peter. The same thing is true for everyone. Everyone has that potential of being obedient to God, and once obedient to God, going right back into the world. Everybody can do that. That is the potential. Anyone can do it. And as Paul states, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Therefore, we need God. And now let's go to verse 13. Here in verse 12, don't allow this to happen. And this word that you should obey it in its lust, that is something that you ought not do, you can do. It's very possible that you do it. All right? And here's a direct command, don't do that. Verse 12. Now we come to verse 13. And do not, here's another restriction. Do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. Okay, with this, you have these verse 12 and verse 13 of where he's saying this is what you are not to do. And it would be absurd, absolutely absurd, to suggest that Paul would give them a command, and in this instance, two negative commands: do not do this. It would be absurd to say he's giving them these commands of do not do this, do not do that, if it was impossible for them to do it in the first place. All right, which some say, some teach that once saved, always saved. Once saved, you can never be in sin ever again. The Bible doesn't teach it. Not from Christ, not from any apostle, not from any prophet. No one teaches that. No one. And this do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin means something that you are not to do. Something you ought not do this. Then he switches it and says, this is what you are to do. But present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. So that before we were saved, we had the ability in any given situation to choose right or to choose wrong. In any given situation. We had that ability. I have always had that ability. In every given situation, we can choose the right and we can choose the wrong. Sometimes we did one, sometimes we did the other, and it was the sin that caused the problem. Okay, now, after salvation, after being saved, how is it that some will teach that we don't have that ability anymore? That we don't have that, we can't possibly do that anymore. That in any given situation, we will always choose the right. Or in any given situation, as some will say, it doesn't matter which way you choose. You will always be safe with God. It doesn't matter which way you choose. But that's simply not the case. All we have to do is just give a simple reading of the New Testament and come to discover that is false. That's very false. We have examples, we have direct statements, we have things that are shown to us in numerous different ways, from direct statements to parables to visions. They're all given to us, showing that the whole notion that someone is once saved, always saved, is never even a thing. Not by name, not by concept. It's not there. Okay. Now we go to verse 14. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Yes, you are not under law, but under grace. Law, he's already been talking about that. Law, now we're under the law of Christ. We're under that. And under the law of Christ, we have grace. Now, we're not under law, but we're under grace. How is that? Because law cannot save you. That's not what law can do. Law cannot save you at all. That while one can be obedient to the law, once you are disobedient in one part, you are disobedient to it all. Or the entire law comes down on you. Just in one matter, just in one thing. Someone could say, well, I never committed murder. Okay, you never committed murder, but did you steal? All right, well, yeah, I did do that. All right, then the law comes down on you. And the law cannot take away sins. The law never brought grace. Not once. The law never brought grace. And with that, the law cannot save you. It is Christ who brings grace. And Christ also brings the perfect law of liberty, also called the law of Christ. Okay? And this is in Romans 6 and verse 14, sin shall not have dominion over you. All right, now understand, in verses 12 and 13, he says, don't let it. In essence, he's saying, don't let it have a dominion over you. All right, do not let sin reign in your mortal body is the same thing as saying, do not let sin have dominion over you. It's saying the same thing, but he's in verse 14, he's saying that you have every blessing in Christ. You have grace from Christ. You have every blessing from Christ. You have the whole armor of Christ presented to you. The whole armor of Christ to protect you in this warfare. A war that began Genesis chapter 3 with the appearance of Satan as a serpent tempting Eve. Adam and Eve fall for that deception, and sin enters the world. And from that point, there has been death, and also from that point, there has been warfare going on this earth. And we, as humanity, we fail. Okay. We fail. We have to have God. God brought His Son. God brought grace through His Son. All right? You're not under law, but you're under grace. And he's showing a distinction. He's still addressing the Jewish world. He's still addressing that. And he's in chapter 7, he's going to be showing that more specifically in this. But he's been talking about the Jewish world, that of maintaining, keeping the law of Moses, which we're not under the law of Moses anymore. All right, let's address that for a second, because we need to understand that the law of Moses began at Mount Sinai, and it came to its fulfillment. That means came to its close. It did precisely what it was supposed to do. It came to its close at the cross of Christ. When Christ died, everything changed. Grace enters the world. That is through Christ. Grace that can, in fact, take away the sins of the world. That came into being right there. Also, what came into being is everything that was imperfect, that is imperfect, it cannot take us to the end of time, comes to a close. Law of Moses is imperfect in that way. It's absolutely perfect to bring in the Christ, but the Christ has to die on the cross to bring about His testament. He has to die, in which the New Testament tells us that. You have to have the death of the testator for the last will and testament to be in full effect. You have to, someone's will is of no effect while that person is still alive. It's of no effect whatsoever. They're waiting for the death of that person. Then it comes into full effect. All right? Now, with Christ brings, at His death, the old covenant, that is the law of Moses, comes to an end. Does that mean we're not under the Ten Commandments? Yes, that's what that means. We are not under the Ten Commandments. That's the law of Moses. Does that mean that nothing from the Ten Commandments is now in the law of Christ? No, it doesn't mean that either. All right? Because there are certain things that have always been wrong, and there are things that have always been right all the way to the beginning of time, before there even is a Moses, before there even is a Moses on Mount Sinai. There are things that have been universally true from God all the way from the beginning. Okay? 1, disobedience to God is always sin. See that in chapter 3, Genesis. Chapter 4, murder has always been wrong. Thou shalt not murder. All right, thou shalt not kill really means thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not murder. Well, that predates the law of Moses by thousands of years. A long time. All right? But when you have the Christ's law, the perfect law of liberty, we also see there, not only is murder wrong, but what does He say about being angry against your brother without a cause? What does He say about murder starting in the heart? What does He say about that? That we are to check that from the beginning. Don't even dwell on it. Don't even have that in your heart. Get rid of that. You have a hatred towards someone, that's the beginning. Stop it. Okay? That's the beginning. You stop it. You stop it right there. You resent somebody, harboring some kind of perpetual anger against somebody, you stop that. You stop it there before it goes any further, because it can fester and it can get worse and worse and worse. That is sin reigning in your mortal bodies. That's exactly what it is. That's precisely what it is. And this is to be stopped. Now we come back to 14 again. So Romans chapter 6, verse 14. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Grace brought you out of this. The law of Moses didn't bring you here. The law of Moses could only get you so far, and then it took Christ. Okay? For the Jews, it's time to follow God. What does that mean? That means the law of Moses, when it was established by God, it was legitimate. When the law of Moses came to an end, it was ended by God, and that's legitimate. But He doesn't leave us, and I didn't even mention law of patriarchy. Law of patriarchy had been around all the way back from the beginning. That too came to an end. Now there's no longer Greek or Jew or Greek. There's no longer that separation between Jew and Gentile. All are under one law under Christ. And all are given the same grace from Christ. Everybody. Everybody. And it doesn't matter now what your nationality happens to be. Personally, I don't think I'm a descendant of Abraham. I mean, I can't prove it one way or another. but I don't think that I am. What kind of hope would I have if I was hoping on that? Because I can't even prove it. Okay, I can't even prove it. There would be no hope in that. So I don't know. You know, after you've got an awful lot of ancestors. Okay, you have an awful lot, and there's no way to know who all is in your line. There's no way to know because it compounds every time. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32, and 64. Each generation you go back is just more and more and more and more and more. All right, so what am I getting at? I'm getting at the fact that it doesn't matter where you're from. We are all under the law of Christ. Whether you obey it or not is your own doing. But we're still under it. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. That's Christ having all authority. He gets to decide concerning how he's going to establish his church, what his church is going to do, everything concerning his church, everything concerning salvation, everything concerning what his laws will be. He gets to decide, and he did decide, and he did not give that right to anyone else. He did not give it to any apostle. When he tells the apostles, and let's just go there. Let's go to Matthew chapter 16, because I think it would behoove us if we went back to Matthew chapter 16, because I want you to see something. All right, because one may think that Christ gave Peter or others the right to make doctrine, and he didn't. He didn't give anybody that right. All right, no one gets to make doctrine. It's Christ only. If he had decided by his authority he was going to give that authority to somebody else, then, I mean, he could do it, but he didn't. He could tell us that he did, but he doesn't say such a thing. He doesn't say that at all. Now, let's just go to verse 17. Matthew 16, verse 17. Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Not revealed what? Flesh and blood didn't reveal this? What? That you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's a truth. All right? Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. All the work that God did reveals, absolutely proves that Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ, the Son of God. All right? That's how God revealed it to Peter and to us, as a matter of fact. Flesh and blood doesn't reveal it. It's God who revealed it. And we see through his words revealing it. Now, verse 18, "And I say to you that you are Peter," that's Petros, "and on this rock," Petre, different word. It's a feminine form of Petros. This is Koine Greek, which is what the original New Testament is written in. The original New Testament is Koine Greek. "You are Petros, and I say to you, upon this Petros, Peter," all right, that is just a small stone. Okay, a stone you can pick up and you can throw. All right, that's what Petros means. Petre, however, is a different form of that word. It's the feminine form of that word, but it is a huge rock. It is a mountainous rock. You could not pick that up and throw it. The rock that Peter's name is based off of, that kind of rock, you couldn't found anything on. You couldn't build any object on top of that rock. It's too small. What he describes, "Upon this rock, this massive rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Death is not going to stop it. Death can't stop it. All right, that's what he means by gates of Hades. Death can't stop it. And yes, the word there in the Greek is Hades, not Gehenna. It's not hell. It's Gehenna. The gates of hell are not being discussed here. It's the gates of Hades. Death will not prevail against it, meaning that, yes, Jesus is going to die. He's going to be dead. from Friday afternoon to Sunday morning. Then he's back. He's resurrected. So it didn't prevail. But what I want us to see is, what is that rock that he's describing that he's going to found the church on top of? What is that rock? That rock is the very truth that Peter just said. Back in verse 16, Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That is the rock. Now, we come to verse 19. This continues what Jesus said. "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Now, I'm reading from the New King James, and the New King James has this rendered a certain way that's not the way it ought to be rendered. In my center column, it shows the way it should be rendered. Why they chose to do what they did, translators get into arguments, who knows. But they put it in the center column of how it's supposed to be rendered. "And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Okay, so that makes it seem like whatever Peter decides he's going to bind, heaven says okay. Whatever he decides to loose, heaven says okay. What does binding and loosing even mean? That concerns laws that you are bound to, or laws that you're not bound to. Okay, things of the past that have always been bound, and suddenly someone decides, okay, this is now loosed. All right? God doesn't work that way at all. He's not telling Peter that he has the right to do anything, because in the original Greek it reads like this: "And whatever you bind on earth will have been bound." That's past tense. It's already been bound. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven, which matches precisely with what Christ told them in places such as John 15, what he talks about. There are more things that he wishes to tell them, but he can't because they couldn't bear it yet. But he was going to depart, and he was going to send the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, down, who is going to guide them into all truth. Guide them into how much truth? All truth. And it doesn't appear to me like that whole idea of guiding them into all truth gives them any space at all to make up their own. Because they don't have any space. They don't have any room to decide, okay, instead of we need a law over here, God forgot this entirely. We need a law about this, so we're going to make that law, and God is going to say that it's okay. There's no room for that. It is complete. And there's nothing God forgot anyway. There's nothing he forgot. It is all here. It's all present. Now, if someone wants to say he was addressing Peter only, he wasn't. We go just to chapter 18 and verse 18. We're still in Matthew, chapter 18 and verse 18. And here he's talking, well, let's go to verse 1, okay, of chapter 18. "At that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?'" And so in this chapter we know who he's talking to. He's talking to his disciples. And we see verse 18, "Assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now he's talking to his disciples now. He's not talking to just the apostles, and he's certainly not talking to just to Peter. He's not addressing them at all. What is he saying? He's saying it's the same mistake from the translators, but the Greek is the same. Whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. That whatever has been bound is going to be given to you, and you are to bind it. Whatever is loosed in heaven is going to be given to you, and you can't bind the things that have been loosed, nor can you loose the things that have been bound. Okay? And this is description of obedience. Whatever God bound, you're bound to it. Therefore, you obey it. Whatever God has loosed you from, Well, you can't bind that. Okay, so let's describe what did God loose, because I don't think we've discussed that. What did God loose? What laws in the past did God loose under the law of Christ? The biggest one is that of animal sacrifices. There are no more. There's no need for it because Christ took care of that. Animal sacrifices were just a shadow of the sacrifice, which is Christ on the cross. That's all that was. Once you have that sacrifice being done by the Son of God, there is no need for animal sacrifices anymore. They couldn't take away the sins. They couldn't take away your sins anyway. The blood of bulls and goats can't do that. The Son of God can do that. So that's loosed. Prior to the cross of Christ, that was bound. Okay? Even today, the Jews don't have a priesthood. They don't make animal sacrifices as they're supposed to under the law of Moses. That's what they're supposed to do, but they can't. They don't even have a temple to do that. God took that away AD 70. All right? All that's gone. They cannot be biblical. You cannot practice biblical Judaism. You cannot. Those things have been taken away. There are other things that have been taken away as well. One, observing the Sabbath. That's been loosed. So anyone who is bound by it, such as a Peter or even a Saul of Tarsus, been bound by it at one point in their lives, are now loosed from it after the cross of Christ. It's been taken away. So and we could look at numerous things of the dietary laws that the Jews were under, the restrictions concerning dress and how you could dress yourself, and the materials. And there's numerous things that have the Levitical priesthood, that's done away. Now we're under the order of Melchizedek. Those things have been done away with, and I wouldn't even know there was an order of Melchizedek except that the book of Hebrews tells me there is. I wouldn't even know it except for the New Testament telling me that these are the changes that have been made. Okay, now we come back to Romans. Romans, back to chapter 6. And we come to this, verse 15. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? Certainly not. No, you're not to be doing that. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves whom you obey, whether to sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? Okay, you can be a slave to sin or you can be a slave to righteousness. Which one is it going to be? Sin leads to death. Righteousness or obedience, you have slave to being a slave to Christ, obedience to Him, that leads to righteousness. Okay, which one do you want? And one can choose at any point in their life, regardless of their situation, any point in their life, someone can make the decision, I want to go with on this side with sin, or I want to go on this side with God. You can make the decision any time in your life, regardless of your situation. Regardless of your situation. Here on this earth, you can make those decisions. You can make those decisions. And as we have already stated, one can be saved and go right back into the pollutions of the world. Go right back to their former life. If that is not the case, then what we read just in verses 12 and 13 are pointless statements. Do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies that you should obey in its lust. Do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. All right, if you cannot go from that point of being a child of God back into the world, these two verses alone are rendered meaningless. Okay? Rendered meaningless. It would be like someone saying, don't you flap your arms and fly away from here. All right, that's an absurd thing, because flapping your arms won't lift you and let you fly. Okay? That's an impossibility. Don't pick yourself up by your hair and float around. Well, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's an impossibility. And for Scripture to be stating impossibilities as though they are possible, what does that mean? Well, either the writing is pointless or the interpretation is wrong. The interpretation is wrong. That Christ is telling us through His Apostle Paul that we can let sin reign in our mortal bodies even after we have been saved. Okay? So, verse 15 again. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? Certainly not. That would be an abuse of grace. Because I'm under grace, I'm going to sin even more because I'm under grace. All right? That's trampling the cross of Christ underfoot, is what that is. That's saying, I'm taking your grace that you've given me, I'm just shattering it. I'm using it now as a license to sin, and God didn't give it as a license to sin at all. If that's what grace gives, humanity would be best without it. Let's face it. If grace gave the license to sin, humanity would be better off without that grace. Just allow us to in the sins that we're already in, and don't give us a license to do even more. All right? Don't give us that, because we would be better off not having that and having to worry about, well, just how worse is my punishment now going to be. Christ did not give us this so that we could sin more, sin with a clear conscience. He did not. Now, verse 16 again, do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slave whom you obey? Okay. Now, we don't like thinking of things in this way, but when something occupies your time so much and occupies your mind so much, you need to step back and ask, is this making me a slave of that, whatever that is? All right. There have been times when I have been taken by something and my mind is on it. Any free moment, that is the very thing that I'm doing. And then I have to pull back and say, is this really what I need to be doing? Is this really how I should be spending my time, spending my life on this? Why? Just need to ask the question, why? Are there not better things? Well, yeah, there are better things. And and here is reality. You're either slaves to sin or you're slaves to Christ. You don't have any other choice. You either are serving sin or you're serving Christ. He who does not gather with me scatters abroad. Okay, scattering is a work too. Gathering with me is a work of Christ. Scattering is the work of sin and Satan. All right, that's a work too. There is no third option of some kind of neutral party. I'm going to play Switzerland here. I'm going to be a neutral party. I'm not going to be on gathering nor scattering abroad. And Christ said that doesn't exist. It's either one or the other. And as we've been looking at the life of Paul on Wednesday mornings, Saul of Tarsus, would have thought, putting it, now Saul of Tarsus, before chapter 9, does not believe that Jesus is the Christ. But taking the words of Christ as a matter of describing obedience, Saul of Tarsus would have thought that he was gathering with God. But he's not. He finds out he's scattering. He finds out he's on the wrong side of things. He's on the wrong side of God. That's what he finds out. And it was disturbing, to say the least. It was earth-shattering and it was disturbing. Now, he discovers he's been a slave to sin and didn't even know it. And yeah, we can be in that situation. A slave to sin and we don't even know it, don't even realize it. But we need to step back and take a look. Are we being obedient to God as we should be? Are we doing the works of God as we should be doing them? What are we doing? Let's just ask that question. What are we doing? Are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? And there is a diligence that must be involved in this, in that sense of oughtness that he's been stating, that these are the things you should do, and these are the things you should not do. This sense of oughtness that are here. Now, we go to verse 17. But God be thanked that though you were slaves to sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. All right, they've been delivered from sin. Is by the grace of Christ. They've been delivered from sin. They've been delivered as slaves of sin. And they did what? Obeyed from the heart. Obeyed what? What did they obey? That form of doctrine to which you were delivered. It is the doctrine of Christ that brings you to the understanding of what you are to do. The doctrine of Christ is vital. It is vital. You cannot have Christ without his doctrine. There are people in the New Testament, they liked the miracles of Christ. They didn't like his teaching. They were going to make him be king. They wanted to force him to be king in John chapter 6. John chapter 6, they wanted to do that. They loved the miracles. They loved what they saw. But when he spoke concerning doctrine, they didn't want that. They rejected that. Here is a man that is performing these miracles, this man who gives so many advantages that nobody else can give. And you're going to reject him because you don't like what he's teaching. Maybe those things that you do like, the miracles and the goodness and the healing and the feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness, maybe those things are to point to validating him as being from God, showing that his teaching must be from God as well. It must be. So you're going to throw all that away simply because you don't want to do the will of God. Well, yeah, that's what they did, but it's nothing unique to them. People have been doing that generation after generation. Matter of fact, most people in every generation have rejected the words of God. Most people have. Now, we go to verse 18. All right, so they were delivered as slaves of sin. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. All right, you became slaves of righteousness. One way or another, you're going to be serving something. One way or another. There is, even if you say you're serving yourself, what you're doing is scattering abroad. That's what you're doing. Once again, there is no neutral point in this. The parable of the talents, you had the servant with the one talent. He doesn't lose that talent. He saves that talent. But he does nothing with it. He does nothing with it. And when the owner, the master, when his boss returns, he presents him with the one talent. And he is called lazy and he's called wicked. Now, sometimes we think someone who's lazy is not wicked because they're not really going out harming people. They're not really going out. They're doing nothing is what they're doing. They're doing nothing. But Christ considers someone who is not showing due diligence, who's not showing the work that they should be doing, as lazy and wicked. Both. Now, You've become slaves of righteousness. That's what they have done. Verse 19, I speak in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you presented your members as slaves of uncleanness and of lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present yourselves. This is a command. Present yourselves members as slaves of righteousness for holiness. This is something that they control. You are to present yourself this way. That is something that you are to do. So that means that this is a command. So that means potentially they might not do that. Yeah? We can go to places like 1 Corinthians and show where the people, most of the people in the church as presented in 1 Corinthians, were not doing this. They were not presenting themselves as these members of, as slaves of righteousness for holiness. They were not presenting themselves as that. They were in every sort of evil thing going on, and then some. They were doing that. And Paul, through the Holy Spirit, corrects them. Verse 20, for when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. Righteousness was, you were free from that, which is a bad thing. What fruit did you have then in the things of which you are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. But now, having been set free from sin and having become slaves of God, you have your fruit to holiness and the end everlasting life. Now, here is a thing concerning fruit. He's making fruit as an analogy, and Christ did the same thing. All right? Bad fruit is bad fruit. The grace of God does not make bad fruit good fruit. Doesn't do it. The grace of God, the grace coming through Christ, does not make bad fruit good fruit. But what the grace of God does, and the doctrine of God, because they had to obey the doctrine of God. That's what he just said. That obedience to that doctrine that in fact saved them. All right? What that doctrine can do is change a bad tree to a good tree. Doesn't change. And now you have good fruit. It's not the same fruit. This is good fruit. An evil act is always an evil act. That's bad fruit. A good act, a good work, that which is good is good. That's good fruit. And that's the fruit that God demands. God demands the fruit of righteousness. He doesn't make that the fruit that's unrighteous now righteous, because that's like saying, well, murder that was wrong is now okay, or that homosexuality that was wrong is now okay. He's not saying that at all. That's still bad fruit. Change the tree. We are trees that can be changed, and we can decide on our own. It is God that gives us the guidance to it. It is Satan that gives us the temptation away from it. It's us who decide. We decide what we're going to do. And want to thank everybody for being with us. We will continue hopefully next week, and appreciate your attention as we're going through this book. Thank you, everybody.